Between choosing art and warfare, Kentaro Miura chose both. And he made that very clear in the design of Griffith's armor, which echoes real history. And I'm going to prove it to you. Allow me to explain. It's not just fantasy. Griffith's armor speaks volume for historical accuracy. And if you're anything like me, a history enthusiast, you will find yourself occasionally irritated whenever you watch any historical adaptation. And you find, just by the eyesight, that the creators had no idea and did zero research on the area they were working with. Fortunately for us, Berserk fans, we don't have to worry about that because Kentaro Miura was not only passionate about drawing, but you can tell by the way that he draw that he was also passionate about history. So in this video, we're going to talk about how he intertwined and woven so majestically art with historical accuracy and how he included as well the characteristics of the Gothic armor from the 15th century in the design of Griffith's armor. That in my opinion, sometimes, can be a little bit more beautiful than the Berserk armor itself, but that is topic for another conversation. In the meantime, hi, my name is Victoria, and in this channel is where passion meets curiosity. This is my corner to talk about history, literature, study, and creativity. So like and subscribe for more if you want to see more videos where fiction meets history and symbolism meets with plot. Berserk is a manga created by Japanese artist Kentaro Miura. This is a tale of human nature in its purest and rawest form. This is where love, dreams, and companionship meet the gruesome shadows of humankind. This is a work of fiction that plays with the contrasts in humanity. That is, the brightest qualities and the darkest vices. So by all means, this is a dark, high fantasy. Berserk has as well an amazing world building. It has magic, mythical creatures, complicated geopolitical factors, and a delicious internal and external conflict. But it doesn't end up there. In my opinion, Berserk has, if not the most lovable, at least the most memorable characters that I've ever read. Their stories are so complex. You see them cry, you see them being happy, you see them rejoice, you see their pains, you see how they evolve and how they grow, and sometimes how they become the worst creatures that have ever existed in the universe. At the end of the day, it shows us humanity at its purest form. And if that wasn't enough, Berserk is not only very well written, but is magnificently drawn. I wasn't interested in reading manga at all until I found Kentaro Miura's art. The way this man would draw was mesmerizing. His areas of expertise were double-page panels in which you can see the extensive detail of the scenario. So if you draw a castle, you could see brick by brick every piece of the construction. If you draw a dragon, you could see every scale on the dragon. If he draw an aerial shot with a river, you could see the pebbles, the goddamn pebbles in the bottom of the river. He was fantastic and majestic in the way that he drew. In fact, his drawings remind me a lot to El Bosco and to Gustave Doré. And Kentaro Miura knew as well how to appreciate other cultures. It was so diverse to the point that you could see characters that were very well represented by different ethnic groups, and they were represented very respectfully and quite admiringly, if you ask me. I was admired by the way that he was able to merge characteristics and characters from Hinduism, a little bit of Aztec and Mayan imaginary with the European world. It's just so beautiful that you seriously need to stop for a second and just appreciate the art. You need to forget about the dialogues and the plot. There were moments that I just had to look at the picture, square by square, in the panels of the manga, because it was genuinely beautiful and sometimes terrifying as well. Because on top of being diverse, he was also out of this world. Some of the monsters and creatures that he invented, that I'm sure that he created, look so alien at times. They look from outer space, and they're both sublime and terrifying. And if I had to describe Griffith, I would describe them with those two words, sublime and terrifying. But of course, Griffith as a character, he's also very unique. And his whole personality, his whole history, and his motives definitely will be part of another video later on. But one of the first things that I noticed about him, other than his very complicated personality, is his design. I was mesmerized and fascinated by the way that Kentaro Miura drew armor, but the way that he decided to represent Griffith's armor was just chef kiss for me, because it's so historically accurate that it was right from the get-go. You can see how passionate Kentaro Miura was about history. Medieval armor up to this point, it's almost mythical. Whenever we think about the Middle Ages in general, we think about princesses and castles and dragons and mighty heroes with shiny swords. We also think about the brightest knight with silver plate armor. However, that is not entirely true. It is based on certain elements from real history, but this is a version, an idealized version, made by the Victorians throughout the 19th century, which for some reason they decided to obsess with the with the Middle Ages, and that's why we think about these medieval idealized imaginary. However, in order to understand the armor, we need to understand the times. So the Middle Ages are a very complicated and vast amount of time. It's a historical period that lasted almost 1,000 years. It went roughly from the 5th century, right after the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire, and ended up in the 15th century, right before the Renaissance. So as you can see, a lot of things happen in 1,000 years. A lot of improvements, a lot of different ideologies, and of course, technology. Believe it or not, the Middle Ages was not this obscure and dark era in which no one learned anything. Of course, there were certain restrictions made by the church that restricted a little bit the areas of investigation and research, but for good and for worse, warfare was one of the primary activities throughout the Middle Ages. So war and everything related to war was very important to them, and if not important in a sense of glorifying war, it was rather necessary, because many of the nations that we know of as today were actually formed throughout the Middle Ages. So the foundations of many nations were due to the Middle Ages. Now, I don't want to glorify war or military affairs by no way, shape, or form, but we need to come to terms that for people in the medieval times, warfare was a big deal. And so because it was a very expansive and vast timeline, historians divided into 3 sections. In the first side, we have the early Middle Ages that roughly go maybe from the 4th and 5th century. Keep in mind that when it comes to history, there are no clear lines to define the end of an era and the beginning of another. So be open-minded in that aspect. So the early Middle Ages might vary from country to country and from continent to continent as well. But roughly we could say that from the 4th and 5th century, it's when the early Middle Ages took place up to the 10th century. Then we have the High Middle Ages from the 10th century up to the 13th century. And lastly, we have the Low Middle Ages from the 13th century and the 15th century. And this is where medieval armor comes in, or at least the sign of Griffith's armor, because these idealized imagery that we have about medieval items or medieval worlds come from the representation of medieval armor in the 15th century in the Low Middle Ages. However, before the Low Middle Ages, the early and High Middle Ages, when it comes to armor, they inclined or resembled a little bit more into the stylistic choice of the classic world. So everything that was Roman or Greco-Roman was more prominent at the time. So armor seemed more similar to the lorica or the stigmata, which was the Roman armor that in fact was stolen from other tribes and other cultures, but definitely that is topic for another conversation that I will be talking about. But yeah, the armor looked more to the ancient world back in the day. And later on, it improved until the chainmail came to the customary representation throughout the Middle Ages. But don't get confused. Don't get confused. The chainmail was present in history since the Bronze Age. Although the chainmail is most of the times made of iron, sometimes, especially in its very, very early stages, it was also made of bronze. One important thing to note is that it doesn't matter the historical period. In most instances, anything related to warfare and to protective wear in the battlefield was made to be functional and to serve certain needs the soldiers and the armies had back in the day. So the armor that was prominent throughout the early Middle Ages and the High Middle Ages was meant to fight with hand-on-hand type of combats. Back in the day, the armies would clash out at each other, so it was at short distance. Also keep in mind that the weapons and the infantry were also made for short distances. So the customary fashion, for example, for helmets were open helmets, where the soldier could have major visibility in the battlefield. Of course, the primary source of protection was the chainmail. A chainmail is a type of armor that is made of small iron rings interchained, hence the name, chainmail. Underneath the chainmail, the soldier would wear padded garments that added extra protection, and these garments were called gambesons or doublets. Armies as we know them today didn't exist, especially not in the Middle Ages and definitely not in the English Middle Ages. Armies were not uniform, not even in unit, and definitely not in the clothing that they wore to the battlefield. So people would wear their gambesons or their tunics in every color that they wished or that they had access to. In some instances, maybe lords or generals might add an additional tunic on top of the chainmail or the gambeson just to represent the family that they served to. For example, with a coat of arms or with something that was representative of the feudal lords that they served to. Also, it's very important to mention that medieval armies were not a solidified one unit, but was rather private armies. It was very common that every lord that could afford, pay, and sustain a private army, they would have them just in the backyard. And many of the wars that have been fought throughout history in the Middle Ages were actually combined from different lords, dukes, and marquises. So yes, that's how more or less the medieval army worked in those days. And as a fun fact, the first English unified army that appeared in history was under the rule of Henry VII, the father of the tyrannic Henry VIII. And he was one of my favorite kings from Great Britain. One day I will be talking about my winter king, Henry VII. But let's keep on track. And as you can imagine, everything changed by the 14th and 15th century. Can you imagine why? The reason was because of the introduction to the longbow and to the gunpowder. Now, with the existence of these two very destructive weapons, needs changed in the battlefield. Therefore, armor also changed. This is when plate armor, or the idea that we have of medieval armor, comes into the scenario. Now, by the 14th and the 15th centuries, armor was a full set. It had multiple pieces that all put together form an entire suit. And so the soldier was protected from head to toe, and it had a articulated system. An articulated system means that it was joined by the articulations in the human body. So you have shoulders, elbows, wrists, knees, so on and so forth. Therefore, then we had inclusions of different pieces. Also, the fashion for helmets changed. Instead of having open visibility with open helmets, then they became enclosed. Can you guess what? This way, they could prevent any long lost arrow, and their eyes and faces were more protected. Despite that now armors had multiple pieces and its very intricate shape, plate armor was actually quite light. An approximate amount of weight went around 20 to 25 kilograms. Sometimes these could be heavier, especially for jousting wear or jousting items, in which the knight will have more pieces to protect himself. When it comes to plate armor, we can think of two of the most famous styles. On one side, we have the Italian armor that, as the name says, comes from Italy, more specifically from Milan, and we have the Gothic armor that comes from Germany, and that was vastly used in Germany and in England. Even though the discussion around these two sets might widely vary. For some others might be quite subtle, but for others might be quite big and huge, the differences between of them. However, we can come up with some terms to differentiate them. My English is not Englishing, guys. So we can separate them from each other. And the characteristics go as they follow. So for the Italian armor, we have a more cleaner design. It has silver finishing and a rounder shape. As well, it was asymmetrical. The reason behind this is because whenever you push forward your body, one side of your body will be more exposed. So that one side of the body will be more protected, therefore the asymmetrical appearance. Now for the Gothic armor, we have a more stylish version, a more stylized, and it has corrugated finishing. Also has a angular shape and a symmetrical appearance compared to the Italian. And one thing is for sure, as with any piece of garment that humanity has ever used, the type of armor would make quite evident your social class and the amount of money that you or your family had. Because now, of course, as I was telling you, because of the improvement and because we have like more pieces to add into a full set of armor, and because this was not provided by the lords that they served to, soldiers, and especially infantry, they would buy whatever they had in hand. And they would use whatever they had in hand. So sometimes they would thrift, sometimes they would exchange, sometimes they would made very cheap custom pieces, whatever it was practical and useful for them. In most instances, this idea of the great knight with their silver plate armor is actually nobility. Only noblemen, lords, and generals were able to provide for a full set of armor. Now join me to the other side so we can talk about my favorite part of the video, and that is of how can we see these historical representations in the drawings of Kentaro Miura, especially in Griffith's armor. So I have here on my dashboard, is that a dashboard? Whiteboard, a whiteboard. My English is not Englishing today, guys. But yeah, so we can see here Griffith. And so I decided that I want to talk about his time as the leader of the Band of the Hawk before the eclipse and post-eclipse, because I think that's important. I won't be talking about Femto Because even though I assume his new shape as Femto provides him some sort of protection, I don't think it's an armor. Let's have some discussion over here. Do you guys think that the new Femto figure it's an armor? Because I don't think so. Like for example, the Berserk armor in the God's case, it's an additional system to him. So it's that. By the way, I love the fact that it looks very much like an Escamata armor. We can talk about that later. But yeah, the point is, Femto, I don't think it's an armor, but rather like an exoskeleton for him. But I don't know, guys, what do you think? So that's the main reason why I didn't include his Femto version, because I don't think that's an armor. So I'm only going to be focusing on pre-eclipse, mortal, Griffith, and post-eclipse, the god, demon, whatever thing he turned into. Oops, is that a spoiler? I don't think it counts as a spoiler. We don't know. Anyway, we have him here. So this is Griffith before the eclipse. And as you can see, of course, he is the leader of the Band of the Hawk. Although they're mercenaries, he's supposed to give like these presents. So his armor, it's almost complete. So we have the spauldrons and the pauldrons. These protected the shoulders as well as part of the arm. So the protection goes here and here as well. And where's the eraser? I haven't used this in a while. Oh, there. So yeah, these are the pauldrons that protected the shoulders. Then, of course, the most significant one is the breastplate, or cuirass. Is that how you pronounce it? But the breastplate. This goes on the entirety of the chest, and it covered the back too. But as you can see, the pauldrons were interconnected. So one unified the other, and they were united with leather straps, as you can see over here. This is accurate too. So yeah, the breastplate. He has no bever, which is quite understandable because even though he's the leader, I don't think he has all of the means. Then he has the gauntlets. Beautiful gauntlets, by the way. And then if we move to over here, and we look at the second half of the body from his hips to his toes, then we can see the rest of the armor. So ideally, the full set of armor would have a fold. A fold would be around this area, and it protected the belly and the pelvis. Underneath the fold would go the quiz. The quiz are these elongated pieces of armor that protected the front part of the leg. And interconnected to the quiz, then we would have the pullein. The pulleins protected the knees, as you can see over here. In his case, his knees are protected a little bit below the bone. However, again, in a full set of armor, then we would have the greaves to protect this part of the leg. They would go over here. I will paste a picture for the reference. But in this case of Griffith, we only have his boots. So as you can see, his armor is not complete. We don't even have the rear brace to protect the elbow and the inner part of the elbow. So he's exposed in that matter. And my favorite panel in the manga is this. Here we can see in more detail the type of armor that he would wear. And just by looking at it, we can say it was gothic. Remember what I told you? The gothic armor had more angular shape. So we have like these angles right here. Again, it resembles very much to the stigmata armor, which resemble the scales of a fish or a reptile. That I think it's beautiful, by the way. Also has a corrugated finished. Look at this. These lines or stripes that make it almost dragon-like, and it goes so symmetrical. It all centers into the body in comparison to the Italian armor. Again, we can see a little bit of the cuis over here. These are the cuis that protected the front part of the legs. We have his gauntlets. And for the helmet, it's quite funny because yes, we have a closed helmet that in this case resembles the shape of a hawk. Before we go and watch Griffith's armor post-eclipse, I want us to look at this one panel. One of my favorites, oh dear God. If only things were as happy as this one panel. Let us appreciate it for a second, okay? The friendship that never was. That never be. So, this is, again, pre-eclipse. Obviously, they're still friends. They're still together. You take that however you like. As in, whatever together you want them to be together. But yeah, they're still friends, and based on the information that I told you about late medieval armor, I want us to look as well how Kentaro Miura represented that knowledge. Again, as I told you, people with more means, with more money, they would afford more elaborated armor. So in the case of Griffith, we have the breastplate, we have the pauldrons, we have the gauntlets, no rear brace, but you know, there's no fold either, but he is quite well protected. He also has the cuisses and the planes as we saw earlier. On the case of Guts is a entirely different case. So Guts only has pauldrons and they're not even complete, so his shoulders are completely exposed. We only have a breastplate. And in the anime, I believe they made the breastplate or the cuirass more as a leather type. I don't remember right now. But yeah, he has a breastplate and I don't think it's made of iron either. We don't have any lower protection, only these pieces of iron on the hips that I don't know what they stand for. These are not the folds, so I don't know what this represented, but they're there. If you know, let me know. And no even protection here on the pelvis either. Just that piece of leather. Quite brave of him. And no protection in the legs whatsoever. When it comes to the rest of his arms, he only has half of the protection. These are not called gauntlets. I will paste the name if I find it. However, it was weird. So yeah, and no protection whatsoever in his fingers, only those bandages. So yeah, as you can see, Guts is a subordinate, and Kentaro Miura also represented the differences in social class. Although both of them were commoners, they were not. Griffith was not a nobleman. Well, a nobleman, who knows? But a nobleman. He wasn't a nobleman at this moment, but definitely he had more money than Guts, and even if he didn't have the money, he was the leader of the Band of the Hawk, so of course he needed to represent certain status. So the more complete his armor, the better it would speak for him, compared to Guts, who is only a subordinate. And that hits right on the core, right?